I'll. Okay, fine.
You can sit here.
Yes.
That would make more sense.
Let me welcome you all, those present physically here and those online watching the live webcast. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, Director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia here at the Watson Institute. I will say something about the Jindal lectures, when they began and how long have they been in existence. Then I'll introduce the topic of the day and then introduce the Jindal speaker and finally the three commentators when their turn comes. The Jindal lectures began 10 years ago in 2012. They're endowed in perpetuity by Sajjan and Sangeeta Jindal, Brown parents, 2011, in the memory of Sajjan's father, O.P. Jindal. The purpose is to have a discussion here at Brown on matters of political, economic, and cultural significance with India as a focus. Past Jindal lecturers have included economists such as Raghuram Rajan, Monte Ahluwalia, Kaushik Basu, political commentators such as Pratap Mehta, Ashish Nandi, literary figures such as Salman Rushdie, Amitav Ghosh, historians such as Sanjay Subramaniam, William Dalrymple, and Ram Guha. Our speaker today is Shekhar Gupta, and the topic is the media and India's democracy today. As far as the international expert assessments of Indian democracy are concerned, a twofold judgment is beginning to emerge. India is doing quite well as an electoral democracy. Elections are freely contested, and turnouts are higher than ever before. 2014 and 2019, for the first time since 1952, the first elections in 1952, India's turnout crossed 65%. But if we were to think of democracy not only as an electoral system, but one based on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of religious practice, that is to say, going beyond elections, then India's democracy of late, according to most expert assessments, has been declining. Is that assessment correct? And how does it affect the media in particular? That's the topic today. And to help us understand these issues, we have on our panel 4 distinguished journalists. And we had in April the first part of this discussion when Siddharth Vardarajan, editor of The Wire, was here. And we had 3 panelists, including Salil Tripathi, who is present today as well. Let me now introduce our Jindal lecturer, Shekhar Gupta. Founder and editor-in-chief of ThePrint, India's fastest growing digital news platform, Shekar is also a prolific columnist with his highly influential and widely read weekly column, National Interest, which has been the source of several hypotheses in my professional life as a political scientist, and is translated in 5 languages. He is a recipient of the Padma Bhushan, which would be the 3rd highest government honor in India. He hosts Off the Cuff, OTC, an offering from ThePrint, which sees him in conversation with an eminent guest twice a month. His daily YouTube show, Cut The Clutter, explains the big news developments of the day from India and around the world. In his 4 decades of journalism, Shekhar has reported, note this, on the Nellie massacre of Assam in 1983, Operation Blue Star, Amritsar, 1984, the student uprising in Tiananmen Square, 1989, Beijing, the fall of Berlin Wall, 1989, 90, 89, 90. The first Gulf War from Baghdad, the first US-backed jihad in Afghanistan, and the many twists and turns in the Sri Lankan civil war between 1983 and 1993. There's the probability that one single journalist would cover so many events of great historic and international significance is generally very low. Shekhar has been exceptionally lucky, I think, and he's had exceptional editors sending him to these world-shaking events. Before ThePrint, Shekhar served as editor-in-chief of the Indian Express for 19 years and also simultaneously held the position of company's CEO for 13 years. He'll speak to us for 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll have the three commentators comment for 10 minutes each, and I'll introduce them as their turn comes. Welcome to Brown Shekhar. He's coming after 11 years. He was here 11 years ago. Welcome once again.
Thank you, Ashu. That was too generous an introduction. But you know what? Given how much abuse we journalists get these days, when you get praise, you take it, right? Usually, your instinct would be to pull out the blue or the red or whatever pen you like to use and cut out the adjectives as usual. But thank you. It's, all of us live in a different environment now. In fact, if you get praised too much, except from friends like Ashu, you worry. So that's one. Second, Ashu said that I got lucky. Yes, I got lucky. I got lucky for where I worked. That was India Today for a long period between 1983 and 1995. And I got lucky also that I got to edit India's finest newspaper, that is the Indian Express, where I had begun earlier and worked for 6 years. And then I got lucky because, as he said, we are all as good as our editors. Allowed us to be a bit loaded. So first enabled us to be, and second, allowed us to be. Because there are always issues, and I see that those issues all the time. Particularly since the rise of news TV, where the editor is also the anchor, is also the star, is also the public face, is also whatever. So then editors don't necessarily any longer allow others to grow, because that is contrary to the business model with themselves, which is one of the unhappy changes. We'll talk about many unhappy changes as we go ahead. So thank you, Ashu. I know that Ashu asked me to have a written lecture. I haven't done it for a long time. I don't think in decades. I just stand and do storytelling, but since it was the professor's order, I actually did it this time. And I thought to myself, lots of people pulled my leg saying, you're making such heavy weather of it, you're typing all the time. And I would tell them that, look, when I joined India Today in 1983, our average cover story should be 6,500 words. And I budgeted for a 45-minute lecture, 6,500 words. And I just think it's too much to write. And then when the average length of an India Today cover story, Salil was there, 6,500 words, some of us, our first draft was never less than 15. I had one colleague who had 25, because we also had one guy in our office, because that place was productivity driven, who would then measure how many words each one had filed every week. And that list was put up on the notice board. And people would bribe this guy, including try and get his grandson admission to a good school, getting his phone repaired. Those days, those were big deals. So he would give you 10,000 words more than the other guy. So life changes, we all change. So I have a written speech now, and I'll read from it. I will go here and there in the middle, and then there'll be questions. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here. So we begin the media and India's democracy today. If you just mention that title, a lot of the audiences, particularly in places like these, would say, what's there to say on media and India's democracy today? It's all over, right? It's all over. You can read an obituary. We all know exactly what's wrong. We all know exactly what's right. So what you're going to hold forth for 6,500 words for, right? So since I have to sing for my supper, I'm going to give you what I think is a nuanced view. It's very challenging these days to give a nuanced view on everything. In fact, that's one reason I have stopped saying almost anything on Twitter for more than 2 years now. I have a large following. 2.5 million is large enough. It could have been a lot more by now, but 2 years back, I said if I'm enforcing discipline on my newsroom, and I've been telling all of them that if you want to say everything that comes to your head on Twitter, get Jack Dorsey to pay your salaries, because Twitter doesn't pay your salaries. So if I am enforcing that on everybody, let me also subject myself to the same discipline. Also because it's impossible to say anything that's nuanced. And if you say anything nuanced, nuance will get lost. So there'll be a lot of nuance, risky thing to do. So the media and India's democracy today, I begin with a quote. It's not about the print, the platform that I run. And I will tell you later if you ask me why is it called the print, because it's purely digital and yet called the print. There's a story there. So, and I quote, "To print or not to print, that is the question," unquote. Like all journalists, the founding patriarch of modern Indian newspaper brought drama, if not originality, to his dilemma, because all of us have the same dilemma now. In addition to the pages of weekly toil sorting types, this is from an era when you put metal types. Is anybody aware of metal types? So in my lifetime, there used to be metal types. In my lifetime, I've gone from filing at least one story on a Morse code telegraph machine, tick-tock, tick-tock, and to what we have now. So you had to sort out those types in the composing room. Salil, are you familiar with types in the consuming room? So,
I didn't want to reveal my age.
I know it. I shall reveal it if you don't. Salil worked for us. So pangs of weekly toil sorting types, James Augustus Hickey complained in a December 1780 column about the misuse of laws and even restrictions through the post office. James Augustus Hickey was the founder of the first newspaper in India, the Bengal Gazette, in 1870. And that's when East India Company, if it wanted, it could just tell the post office not to distribute your paper. Famine doth make cowards of us all, Hickey conceded, but he was made of sterner stuff. He continued to print his original Bengal Gazette. That was the name of the paper. To the predicaments and pain of the present, the lens of history can at best offer small comfort. The libel proceedings and police raids unleashed against the Bengal Gazette by the East India Company's Warren Hastings, fueled, I must admit, by some uncomplimentary observations made by Hickey about Lady Marianne Hastings, will be depressingly familiar to journalists today. In recent years, as you know, journalists have faced online abuse, prosecution, incarceration, violence. As scholars, you will know there has been a growing volume of work expressing concern that India is on the edge of a totalitarian abyss. The argument that Prime Minister... Am I audible? Is this working? Okay. The argument that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has undermined the foundations of India's democracy has been made, among others, by Christoph Schafferlo. Arvind Narayan has argued that we are in the midst of an undeclared emergency, and if I may add, by our host, Ashutosh Varshney. These are among the less alarmist voices. I can quote to you many more alarmist voices. Islam and the Hinduism Islam and the Hinduism in the subcontinent हमेशा खतरे में है. Does anybody get that much Hindi idiom here? If you don't, that Islam and Hinduism in India always see themselves as being in danger. So Islam and Hinduism in the subcontinent हमेशा खतरे में है. Like them, the freedom of the media too has always been in peril, smaller or bigger. The scale changes. The point of this talk is not sab changa si. Remember what Modi said at that was it at Texas at Howdy Modi, sab changa si. Yeah. So the point of this talk is not sab changa si, that all is well. Although whoever used the line for Punjabi, I just told you who used the line, so I'm in trouble. Although whoever used that line from Punjabi confused the past, that is see, with the present, hega in Punjabi. I'm sure that wasn't consciously done or a Freudian slip, that it was all very well in India, right? I don't think it was deliberately done. Nevertheless, that to say all is well is clearly not the case, or we would not be gathered here. But I am not here either to endorse the argument that India has become a dictatorial dystopia in which journalism has become impossible. If that were indeed the case, I'd be here in America, in the promised land, lobbying with an asylum application. Not delivering this talk. It's easy to argue that democracy has collapsed in India and seduced many by adding passion and dramatic intensity to the debate. That position is, I humbly argue, the advocacy of despair and defeat. The circumstances of Indian media today, I would say instead, are ones in which non-partisan, objective journalism must find a way to thrive. Sure, there are problems bigger than before, ranging from pressures by the state, coercion by competing ideologies, and financial stresses. But it is precisely in these situations that good, objective, non-partisan journalism thrives and survives. These are our most challenging times in India, yet good journalism is needed exactly in times like these. See the press here. Terrible, something terrible. It's a quote from somebody. And I shall just give you the context. The Prime Minister of India is not given to sharing his inner thoughts, least of all with journalists. There was one occasion, though, where the curtain lifted. And I quote now, "Some say we are suppressing the press," the Prime Minister told a foreign visitor. He went on, "You see the press here? You see how it functions? Huh? Terrible. Something terrible," he said. He said, and he went on to speak like this of the writings of Indian journalists. And I quote again, "And we found it did little good. The media inflamed communal tensions and spread disinformation. Therefore, we put an end to it." That Prime Minister was, as some of you might have guessed by now, Jawaharlal Nehru, not Narendra Modi. Like all story, it's best to begin at the beginning. And this one begins with the fact that the Indian media has always had a troubled relationship with power, as Hickey's unpleasant encounters with Warren Hastings show. The long history of Indian newspaper struggle against colonial power is embedded in our historical consciousness. It generally isn't acknowledged, though, that independence did not mean freedom for the press. The period from 1930 to 1960, as historian Devika Sethi has pointed out, was one of uninterrupted battles over censorship in India. Following independence, the courts pushed back against efforts by the government to restrict media freedoms. In the 1950s, Supreme Court quashed a ban on the left-wing magazine Crossroads, imposed by government of Madras, as Chennai was called then. It was then a state. Tamil Nadu came in 1968. Although the law did permit restrictions on speech in the interests of public safety, the court held that the term could only reasonably mean significant threats to the state. The court also stopped the Delhi government from pre-censoring the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sanghs, that is the RSS magazine organizer. The state of Bihar was similarly stopped from banning the work of revolutionary poet Shaila Bala Devi, who had written, and this is poetry, "I am the bloodthirsty goddess Kali who lives and moves about in the cremation ground. Plague or famine is my great joy. I am thirsty. I want blood. I want revolution." Today, accustomed as we are to imprisoned undergraduate, today, I'm not so used to reading, as you know. Today, accustomed as we have become to impassioned undergraduate poetry, it would seem implausible that words like these would set independent India on fire. The India of the time, though, was somewhat different from the India we know today. In 1949, tens of thousands of Adivasis had been marched from their homes into de facto concentration camps in an effort to crush a communist insurgency. The Military Intelligence Directorate admitted, this is from archives, the Military Intelligence Directorate admitted 2 years later that there was a paucity of good grains, water, and bare necessities of life at centers where the Adivasis had been concentrated, 1949. In the Northeast, which I covered, as Ashu said, I got lucky to cover many parts of the world where people were not so lucky, and they were making stories that were big stories for us, but they were suffering greatly through them. I was sent to cover the Northeast at the height of trouble in the Northeast between 1981 and 83. So I take you back to the Northeast, where the civil servant Vijender Singh Jaffa hurried to us friends and fellow travelers in the Northeast, where he served as an Assam cadre IAS officer. He reminded us in his book that the armed forces were resorting during the same period to the destruction of entire villages, because they had learned their counterinsurgency from the treatises written by the British on Malayan insurgency. So they were carrying out destruction of entire villages, coupled with forcible relocation of communities in an effort to contain ethnic insurgencies. The village elders of Darzo and Mizoram Mizoram is a distant state in India, still with a population of just over 1 million people. The village elders of Darzo and Mizoram were lined up at gunpoint and told to sign a letter, and I quote now, told to sign a letter that they had burnt down their own village and that no force or coercion was used by the security forces. Jaffa's first posting as a 1965 batch IAS officer was as a subdivisional officer to Lungle, a most distant outpost in Mizoram, where a 2-decade insurgency began in February 1966. In fact, if I take you back, Mrs. Gandhi became Prime Minister of India in the last week of January 1966. She was a very big Prime Minister. 28th of February, within a month of her taking over, the Mizos announced a sovereign republic, and they were about to overrun the Treasury and the District Commissioner's office when Mrs. Gandhi, for the first and the last time in India's history, and hope it never happens again, sent the Air Force to bomb Aizawl town until Indian Army columns could fight their way through the forests into Aizawl. This should not surprise us. Like other post-colonial nations, India had emerged from savage conflict and had at best anemic administrative and economic resources to rebuild. Violence is the child of panic. And India in the first years of its birth was a deeply anxious polity. Following the early judicial gains for free speech, Prime Minister Nehru's government moved to rein in independence of the media. A story magisterially told recently by Abhinav Chandrachud, the lawyer and scholar Gautam Bhatia, and also superbly told of the many battles pitting religious beliefs and social values against free speech. Tripurari Daman Singh's gripping account of the 16 days of intense debate which preceded the passing of the First Amendment to India's Constitution shows how post-independence leaders sacrificed free speech so they could control the public narrative, especially on key issues like caste-based reservations and abolition of zamindari. In some senses, Singh argues, the First Amendment transformed the Constitution itself, gutting its liberal foundations. This position is, of course, contested, but I think it is not unreasonable to suggest that some of the problems the media faces today were embedded in our public debate at the Republic's birth. The story of bludgeoning into submission of Indian media during the emergency and the long battle of attrition newspapers fought with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was personally experienced by some of us here. I was a journalism student during the emergency. and in journalism, a child of the emergency, and therefore a beneficiary of the boom that followed. Got lucky. While some of the excesses, like forced sterilizations, had a more withering impact on the voters in the Hindi heartland, at a pan-national level, what people disliked most of all was the censorship of newspapers. A new social compact between the press, nobody said media then, and the people grew out of this revulsion over censorship. The big danger to Indian media today comes from the fact that this contract, this social contract, is now frayed. And it isn't because of social media abuse or what's called trolling. In the print newsroom, by the way, the word troll is on the taboo list. Nobody is allowed to use that word. And if anybody does, first they hear from me, then they order jalebis, which is a popular Indian mithai. They order jalebis for the entire newsroom in the evening, and they better make sure that the jalebis are piping hot, right? So the word troll is on the taboo list. Once you give people names, troll, fascist, bhakt, Godi media, liptard, secular, anti-national, and so on, all debate ends. So Tihara, who walked me to your center, asked me on the way if I spend time on an American campus or overseas, in the Western world. And I told her that I didn't live on an American campus, but I was involved with Professor Steve Cohen. And I spent time in Washington working with him. So one of the things he used to teach all his students and all the scholars who worked with him was that I ban, if you work with me, the use of two words, superpower and third world, is banned. Because the moment you use one of these, there is no space left for any debate. Then you finish the argument. So similarly, I follow that example and I ban a few words in my newsroom. It was a decade and a half back that our news media, especially TV channels and particularly so in Hindi, switched to the news as free entertainment model. Snakes began marrying trees. You can Google all of this. Snakes began marrying trees. A scary-looking old man would appear every Saturday morning on one TV channel, warning you of the awful things that would happen to you if you didn't propitiate Shani Deva, the Saturn god with oodles of mustard oil and even more money. Food for thought for you. Many of the English channels joined the bandwagon, setting their primetime news coverage to starting drum roll, dun 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 dun, like that. Check out even a dignified channel like India Today TV. Look at the amount of drum roll they use. I worked for that group for 12 years. I win, but they are winning. People were watching, laughing at us and asking if we were worthy of their affection and trust. My latest favorite, by the way, is the story on how Xi Jinping has his stomach upset watching the first Rafale fighters land in India. In fact, I took a screenshot. Rafale pahunche in Hindi. Xi Jinping ka pet kharab. That Xi Jinping is making the runs to the toilet. Right? It's a serious TV channel which I think is at this point #1 in the Hindi ratings list. What does Xi Jinping know? In 3 editions of my weekly column National Interest, I have taken note of this snapping of that holy thread of trust between us and the people of India, of how over these 2 decades the journalist has mostly been portrayed in Hindi cinema as a clown, a thug, a crook, an idiot, or a blackmailer, a traitor. The latest column in this series of 3 was published in November 2021, also talked about how this contrasts with the 1950s, where the journalist was always the good guy. In the 50s, always the good guy, a brave, if poor underdog who always won and even got the girl. In one case, the girl got the guy. This is a film called Solma Saal. I don't know how many of you watch old Hindi movies, a Devanand film, in which Devanand and Madhubala are both journalists and both are hunting for truth and go through many troubles and finally get each other as well. So journalists were doing all right then. We haven't seen many of these lately. The roots of this decline lie in the news media's devastated economics. We will revisit this theme through this talk. On Indian democracy, the point isn't whether it was perfect, a charade, or an illusion. liberal institutional and constitutional values, though, existed in a perpetual state of tension with illiberalism. There is a sense in much writing today that there was a prelapsarian time for the media before 2014. This is simply not the case. Indian journalists have always fought to have their say, sometimes successfully, sometimes, unfortunately, not quite so. Even today, the sound of argumentation and critique is loud across India's media landscape, not the dead silence that follows the fall of an Iron Curtain. If I, as an editor, have a problem today, it is that so much of this debating space, for or against, is dominated by so few bylines. Fine minds, but too few. If there is one thing I really feel passionate about, if there is one mission statement I have set myself at ThePrint, which is on my editorial agenda, it is to disrupt and expand this opinion industry in India. Break this stranglehold of a few good minds. By the way, I am also among those bylines, good mind or not, holding forth on everything from politics to strategic and military affairs, and of course to the subject I know most about, cricket. It needs more diverse, smarter, younger voices like many of you here. The central question for us ought to be, how do we empower journalists and journalism to make sure that it gets better and stronger, whatever the circumstances? Our job is to tell the truth, and it isn't getting easier. For Prime Minister Modi's critics, his rise to office marks a fracture, a fundamental rupture with earlier decades of Indian democratic evolution and commitment. There are several studies and ranking projects which claim to provide various forms of empirical validation of this claim, among them reports published by the Venerable Economist, VDEM, and Freedom House. There is no doubt that Prime Minister Modi deserves the most stringent criticism on many issues. The record of his party, BJP, on Muslims, for example, but we ought to be cautious with hyperbole. As the scholar Salvatore Babones, I don't agree with him on everything he says, has noted, much of the body of legislation that has earned Modi his most severe criticism, in fact, was passed by the UPA government, United Progressive Alliance government, which preceded him. These include, I'm now adding some of these laws, Babones hasn't. These include the draconian amendments to UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, under which you can lock up people forever without bail. Bail is an impossibility under that law. Once you are arrested under that law, bail is an impossibility. And that's the law that Modi government has used to arrest some of these young Muslims on charges of having incited riots in Delhi. But they've been in jail for 2 years. UAPA means no bail. PMLA, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, these are two laws on India's statute book where the burden of evidence for innocence is on the accused. Where you are guilty as charged unless you can find evidence to the contrary. So it's not as if prosecution makes charges, you defend. No, prosecution's charges are valid and accepted unless you can find overwhelming evidence to turn it around. That's not like good civilized states. But these laws came from the UPA, or the setting up of NIA, the National Investigation Agency, which reduces state government's control over the police, because NIA can go to any state now. The CBI, the old agency, to go to any state has to seek the state's permission. NIA does not need it. UPA did it just after 26/11 because that was an opportunity, and UPA thought obviously that they were always going to be in power and no one else was going to come into power. So someone else came to power. And see what's happened. What the Modi government has now done is to use another deadly cliche we've nearly banned in the newsroom. Weaponize them. The lesson is think thrice before making lousy laws, because you don't know who will use them to target who. Even you who passed them. So look at the number of Congress people who've now been charged under the same laws, including the former Home Minister, who was the key figure in passing these laws and amendments, Mr. Chidambaram himself. As a journalist who covered the massacres of Nellie, 1983, massacres of Sikhs in Delhi, 1984, and more, I can say with some confidence that Prime Minister Modi did not invent the communal pogrom. On the walls of the print newsroom, we have pictures of some of India's finest photographers. They've been good enough to gift them to us, including many from our photo editor Praveen Jain, who's about my age and has seen a great deal. One set is of the photographs of the 1987 Hashimpura massacre of Muslims in a locality near Meerut in Uttar Pradesh, just less than 100 kilometers from Delhi. These pictures have army troops marching out groups of young Muslim men, arms raised. The army later handed them over to the state police because the army can't keep anybody in custody. They were handed over to state police, who dutifully took them to a canal and shot them and threw their bodies in the canal. Bodies of 38 of these were found in the canal later, shot in cold blood. Praveen's pictures and testimony were crucial to the conviction and sentencing of the guilty policemen, 1987. Great explosions of communal bloodletting took place long before Modi's name was known. Today, the bigotry and abuse of state powers that harass Muslims in India has gone to another level, is represented by the bulldozer, and is inexcusable. I do not, however, remember a time when things were particularly rosy. The difference now is the abuse of Muslims on social media and rewriting of the rules of decency for the worse in public debate. More importantly, Muslims have been fully excluded from power structure. Not even a constitutional sinecure is open to any of them anymore. So none of our constitutional positions, president, vice president, speakers of two houses, in all of India, only one state governor is Muslim, that's in Kerala, Arif Muhammad Khan. No member of the cabinet is a Muslim. This kind of exclusion has never been there for a community which is 14% of India, which means 1 in 7 Indians has no place in our power structure anywhere. The ruling party, BJP, has won 2 majorities, this time 303 in a house of 543. Not one of them is Muslim. In the state of Uttar Pradesh, India's largest, population the size of Brazil or Pakistan, BJP has twice got 2/3 majority. Last time, in fact, 85% majority without a single Muslim elected. That's because they don't even feel Muslims. They've completely excluded them from the power structure. Moreover, long before Modi, the Indian media often faltered in the face of power, though journalists have mostly elided over those stories in our telling of our own story. The dishonorable role of a not significant section of the media in Punjab is well documented. The best recent account is in the trouble period memoir by brilliant Punjab IS officer Rameshinder Singh. He was the deputy commissioner of Amritsar during Operation Blue Star. In the course of Ram Janmabhoomi movement and in Kashmir, the media allowed its news judgment to be clouded by ideological partisanship. This is not to say the Indian media did not play a brave role in Indian democracy, just that, as with so many things, there is more than one story. The best pictorial evidence of destruction at Ayodhya, at the mosque, also hangs in Praveen Jain's pictures on our walls. Such a shame that the trial judge tossed aside his evidence and his pictures in the court, although he did testify in that court. Little imagination is needed now to see that India has changed and is continuing to change, sometimes in directions we might not like. There is no doubt Indian society has become more inward-looking, and that obscurantism and chauvinism have acquired certain legitimacy. Democracies aren't perfect. Anybody who says their democracy is perfect isn't living in one. Those things are said in North Korea and she's China. Lately, they become more imperfect. That is our democracy. Democracy can produce a Trump, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Netanyahu, Liz Truss, Giorgia Meloni, Imran Khan, Sheikh Hasina, and a Modi. And one of my colleagues in my office had also add Justin Trudeau. So I've added Justin Trudeau also, who I think is probably the nuttiest leader elected by a democracy. Because given his vote bank politics, he's quite happy to to relight a fire that will consume the lives again of tens of thousands of Sikhs in India, mostly in India. So democracies are not perfect. They can produce a Trump, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, then Netanyahu, Liz Truss, may not last long, Giorgia Meloni, Imran Khan, Sheikh Hasina, Justin Trudeau, and a Modi. What will you do if American democracy brings Trump back? In which country would you seek asylum? Come to India, if immigration lets you in. You will stay back and keep up the good fight with sharp argument and sharper facts. That's what good journalism is doing in India right now. Much as we'd like to believe that we are the best, the last hope before apocalypse, the print isn't some rare, remote island of excellence. There is an entire archipelago out there. We've got loads of competition at the print. See the fine job the Hindu and the Indian Express are doing getting the facts from all, not just both sides. From all sides, they keep our young newsroom on its toes. We beat them often enough, though. I fret still that it isn't all the time. We get beaten often enough. So we are not the only ones. In the same game of patient, exacting journalism. What then are the responsibilities of the journalist at this moment in history? I would answer that they are no different from what we have had at all other junctures in our history. The starting point of journalistic examination cannot be the shrill assertion that a cataclysm of some kind, a genocide, Holocaust, mass impoverishment, war, looms, and that it is our job to prevent it. Regime change might be the job of voters, political activists, nation-states, superpowers, a deputy superpower, wanna superpowers, a used-to-be superpower, Russia, a used-to-be superpower. It is not the job of journalists. Regime change is not our job. Our job is to tell the truth as best as we can. It is no small ask. On which note can I ask for some water? The job has now become much tougher. There are rising challenges, both in the newsroom and beyond, in politics and society, shaped by technology, the phone that each one of us is tethered to every walking moment, and presuming that somebody has the keys to that phone, just as you are walking and talking. Apprehension of online abuse, surveillance, taunts that your advertisers might face. Your advertiser or sponsor is walking some corridor, and somebody in power might say, "Oh, you are giving a lot of money to such and such organization. You must really believe in the journalism they are doing." I can tell you, temperature drops to -30 at that point. And all you hear is an apology from somebody, that too not on the phone, when you run into them. Sorry, but somebody taunted me. How can I do this? Anyway. So the job has now become much tougher. There are rising challenges both in the newsroom and beyond, in politics and society, shaped by technology, the phone that I mentioned to you. In the big picture, I shall list 4 big challenges. Number 1, the rampant and unchecked misuse of Indian Penal Code, that's our criminal law. Terror and tax laws to clamp down on free speech. I mentioned earlier that most of these laws have come into effect or have been strengthened in UPA's times, but now the courts, especially the Supreme Court, only they can undo this damage. Next, Chief Justice of India is one who has flagged this often enough so far, so there is some reason for hope. Number 2, the political opposition. Not many across the aisle are also any more tolerant of press freedom. Many of their state governments play from the BJP's playbook. That's why today a pain point is there is so little political cost to clamp down on a free press. Connect this also with the fraying of our social contract with public opinion. Number 3, concentration of corporate ownership of media. This has come when the revenue model for good journalism is broken. The reality with these corporates, especially the biggest conglomerates, is that they have a massive range of non-media businesses where they need the government to be friendly. Media is not even 1% of their turnover. No wonder that the 2 English papers that routinely call out abuse of power are still the Indian Express and the Hindu, both family-owned with no other businesses, where the owners' families have no other businesses. And then upstarts like ours, the new journalist-owned institutions. Number 4, the digital newsrooms the establishment runs, the army of information technology warriors that work 24/7 to delegitimize journalists and journalism. Unfortunately, some of this is also done by many journalists. You disagree with somebody, you malign them. This is a new noise that plugs into the lynch mob. Given the power of the algorithm to shape your revenue, this has consequences. Earlier, you could dismiss, talk, and walk around PR guys and fixers. We've all dealt with PR guys. Today, they have more power digitally. Anonymity of the handle may not exactly be a weapon of mass destruction, but it is as bad as a dirty nuke. Let me add here an inconvenient point that we, Indian journalists, must debate. Is our vision broad enough to engage with and address the electoral success of Narendra Modi? Like him or not, he's come to power. From time to time, democracies will throw up leaders whose values and principles we might find repugnant. I had given you a list a little bit earlier. But democracy is the branch on which our claims to institutional protections sit. And if we hack at this branch, we create the conditions for our destruction. You might know the story of Kalidasa, who hacked the branch he sat on. That's the example. Even as we investigate and critique the Prime Minister's claims, whether to uphold secularism or make Bharat Swachh, Atmanirbhar or digital, or on the stellar management of the economy, it is also important to examine just why he has succeeded in securing overwhelming majorities in parliament and legislative assemblies. That means hard work on the ground, listening to people we do not like with an open mind, we as in journalists. Our inability to do so doesn't help with that vital social contract. Because people then say, what do these guys know? These guys know nothing, because if every election you say, this time Modi is going to be wiped out, thrown out, and he comes back with a bigger majority, the conclusion people draw is these guys are coming with preconceived ideas. They are not doing their jobs properly. That last one I listed is the toughest. Can we handle the truth? Denialism is comfortable but self-defeating and journalistically dishonest. Too often, our failure to engage in the most basic journalistic mission has led us to poor judgments about the present and future. The unpopular anxieties and aspirations that led to the juncture we are now at and what might happen next must be carefully unpacked, understood, and explained. A social media rant, the virtue signaling display of partisanship, the failure to maintain objectivity when assessing questions of fact. Now, this Sunday, Sri Lanka's women, Tihara and I were having a conversation on this. Sri Lanka's women's team and our women's team are fighting in the Asia Cup final. Obviously, I'm on the side of the Indian women. But if we lose, can we change that fact as journalists because we are so powerful? So we've got to accept the facts as they are, and then go on. But if we deny those facts, or if we try and say that, oh, the umpire cheated, in this case, the election was stolen, the machines were bad, or something really awful happened, then we'll have about as much credibility as Donald Trump with his election was stolen charges. These tendencies are as much threats to the media and just as lethal as obsequiousness to power. To cross the line from journalism into political activism or wishful thinking undermines the legitimacy of our profession itself. Edmund Burke once declared the agitator and pamphleteer John Wilkes fitter for bedlam than for public office. From its early years, the written word has been a site of bitter ideological contestation. This is as it should be. The institution of modern mass media, though, rests on a complex set of conventions to do with language, with plurality of opinion, and with ways in which facts are assessed and deemed credible. Through the course of centuries, these conventions have led mass media to develop a relationship of trust with its audiences. This is why generations of readers turn to a newspaper for information rather than a pamphlet tossed on the street, or today, a passionate partisan blog or a tweet. For us to append these conventions to pursue some ideological project, though, is to dismantle the one arbiter of truth we have in democratic societies. That's the free media. The pamphleteer, revolutionary or reactionary, ought to have an important place in democracy. The media ought not to be their home. This is a global challenge, and the world will be a more fraught place if editorial stewardship does not assert itself. Indian media crisis isn't only about Modi. What else is there? 10 years ago, the Times of India proprietor Vineet Jain famously proclaimed, "We are not in the business of publishing newspapers. We are in the advertising business." Ken Oleta, who interviewed him, observed that India is one of the few places on earth where newspapers still thrive. This is no longer true. Long before the shocks of the pandemic hit, revenues for print media had begun to decline, hitting the English language industry particularly hard. Layoffs and cost cutting have become routine, just as they did in the West a decade ago. Figures on television news are famously unreliable and doctored, but the numbers we do have suggest a similar picture. Don't be misled by the recent spurt in bottom lines of some newspapers and TV channels. Almost all of this is largesse from mostly state governments of various parties. This comes at an editorial price, and this won't last either. Like the story of change in India, the crisis facing the media isn't about Narendra Modi, or just about Narendra Modi. For decades, scholars Swati Maheshwari and Colin Sparks have noted that contingent heteronomy, which I think means mutual backscratching in English, governed the political journalist relationship. Governments, both at the center and states, did and continue to punish purportedly hostile reportage and reward the pliant. Check out the archive of Indian journalism. There was a lot more fawning and sycophancy in the papers until 1977. I don't know if you have the archives, but you have access to them. In Indira Gandhi's heydays, in Indira Gandhi's heydays of 1969, 1977, if you find one broadsheet other than the Indian Express, one broadsheet other than the Indian Express that questioned her rising dictatorial tendency and nutcase nationalizations, please do let me know. I'd be grateful. In the Express, in that period, Frank Moraes, who was the editor, wrote a front page column. On the top, signed column, headlined, column was called Myth and Reality. So the myth is Indira Gandhi's socialism will take us to such a utopia, reality, etc., etc., etc. Only one paper. Gatekeeping of sound credibility, trust and quality is a feature of all democratic systems, but media leaders in India have often proved unable or unwilling to push back. For much of modern Indian political history, the ruling party had an unhealthy influence in the editorial leadership of major news organizations. The unedifying stories of editors drifting in and out of government and of government provision of housing and other benefits for some journalists will be well known to those of you who know India. Some of our most eminent editors, and I say with no sense of sarcasm, some of our most eminent editors have walked in and out of government patronage, an ambassadorship, media advisor to Prime Minister, a membership of the upper house, in some cases all of the three, and have still returned to edit major broadsheets and pontificate on integrity and morality. This, fortunately, isn't lost on the audiences, as the familiar Bollywood line goes, "Ye public hai, ye sab janti hai." The people, they know everything. The media needs to keep finding ways to resist coercive action, whether criminal proceedings against journalists or vindictive and fake defamation cases, and threats of closure more effectively. But media leaders also need to introspect about how they put themselves in this position of vulnerability to begin with. Let us start with one central fact. Accounts of great influence and reach of the mass media were overblown. The spectacular growth of Indian newspapers through the 1980s, as Robin Jeffrey has shown, was real and politically transformative. Yet this revolution, riding on back of technology, literacy, and capital, also suffered the same limitations as other sectors of India's economy. From readership surveys, however, we know newspapers reached only 85 of 1,000 people, even at their peak circulations, low by international standards. To grow their readership among the massive unreached audience, the big print media houses, essentially the Times of India group, kept cover prices low, confident that advertising would continue to generate revenues low. How low did they keep their cover prices? Check out The Hindu, a top quality broadsheet today, and the most expensive of all published in the national capital. It is priced at rupees 12. That is a mere 15 cents. 15 cents for a paper like The Hindu. Even this is about twice as much as the rest of the competition, including another fine newspaper, the Indian Express. That's, I think, 6 rupees or 7 rupees. 7 cents. Remember, we all buy our newsprint at the same price as any paper in the world, the New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. It's a global commodity. This advertising subsidized model in India worked perfectly until it didn't. For a variety of complex reasons, private sector advertising revenue slowed down. Oleta received an education in how newspapers had opened their editorial pages to promotion of well-heeled celebrities and brands with content generated by journalists. To be sure, paid content was identified as advertising, but in print so small, Oleta observed, a reader would need a magnifying glass to be alerted. Desperation for revenue has also driven media companies into the business of conclaves, summits, and awards. None of these can work unless the government participates at the top, ideally the Prime Minister himself. You annoy them even one bit and your event economics is over. Others have learned from the political class. Over several years, since I also wore the hat of the CEO at Indian Express, I hosted India's preeminent film awards night, Screen Awards, which we thought were like India's Oscars. While we always chose a good jury and remained firmly hands-off, there were pressures nastier than we might have seen from governments. Unless I get this award, I won't come. Unless my son, or in one case, my father also, that was Hrithik Roshan. He was getting the Best Actor award, but he said the film was directed by my father, so he must get the Best Director award also. And if your jury does not recognize the great talent of my daddy, I'm not coming, right? An hour before the awards event. There were boycotts by the entire star families, and some of those you know, the Bachchan family, 1 year, full boycott. The Javed Akhtar, Shabana Azmi, Farhan Akhtar, the wokest of India's woke star families, full boycott, right? Full boycott, because two of them were getting an award, but not the remaining 5, right? I think that was the year of Dil Chahta Hai, the film. I wrote about this in a column published in July 2020. This is after actor Sushant Singh Rajput died by suicide, and a big controversy broke out about corruption in Bollywood.
You just started a controversy by saying he died by suicide.
Well, but you know, I think Twitter armies who say that he was killed by somebody, we are used to heavier duty trolling than them, so it's okay. So it upset our insistence on protecting the jury, upset so many megastars and their clans that I don't believe I could swing one like that again. The organization was wise, the Express Group was wise to have sold away the award property instead of fielding these demands and tantrums each year. One of the stars, the biggest of them by some distance, also called my former employers in fury sharper than you might have seen in those 1970s angry young men movies, and wanted action. He wanted me sued. What he didn't know was that I had taken the precaution of calling the publisher and saying, listen, I'm going to do this. I hope it's all right by you. And I had mentioned this in the column as well. That's obviously the Bachchan family. Worse than events, sponsors and stars, media organizations became even more dependent on government advertising. Excessive borrowing to expand operations led some organizations into financial difficulties following the 2008 financial crisis. The problems were averted with some behind-the-scenes help, but this came with obvious costs to newsroom integrity and, in some cases, with loss of ownership. The staggering growth of the reach of Indian digital news audiences, which has grown over 450 million by one estimate, ought to provide an opportunity to reset the self-inflicted crisis of traditional media. The core problem, as scholar C.P. Shekhar noted several years ago, is that revenues from digital advertising aren't commensurate with the size of the audience. To make things worse, small news publishers must compete with giant global conglomerates like Google or Facebook for advertising revenues, a problem newspapers did not have. And the conglomerates now not only take a bulk of your revenue, but they don't even tell you how much percentage. Even though the problem of propaganda is not new, and loyal audiences have always sought out content they ideologically empathize with, the rise of institutional media provided a gatekeeping function that provided society with shared reference points to distinguish truth from falsehood. Today, the internet that big tech has crafted no longer permits that distinction to be made. The digital media thus finds itself confronted with existential crisis at its moment of birth. Increasingly, journalism is being driven by search engine optimization, the practice of producing content based on the demands of algorithmic expedience rather than editorial judgment. As we have seen through crises around the world, these algorithms reward polarizing content instead of journalistic credibility. Fake news of various kinds and political propaganda and abusive outlets rank much the same as actual news. Even as I speak to you, the print's journalists are out in the field in Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, and many other states I haven't kept up with while I was in the flight. But I find myself in a minority of editors committed to funding and finding funding for this kind of journalism. If the government would share no more information than propaganda, you have to find the story on the ground. Technology, logistics, the marvelous, fearless openness of the ordinary Indians are field reporters' allies. It's just that it's expensive, and the incentive structure to reward this simply does not exist. So we come towards the conclusion, which I title Whistling in the Dark Towards the Dawn. For years, Andrew Otis records, Hickey made himself a nuisance to East India Company, reporting on, quote, the tragedies and happiness of both European and Bengali poor. For example, he reported a miraculous story of how one woman survived to give birth amid a great fire. He covered the demise of a palm sap picker who fell to his death from a coconut tree. In bringing stories like these to light, he saw himself as a servant to society. The price Hickey paid was not unsubstantial. He was convicted of libel and sentenced to 12 months in prison. The legal proceedings bankrupted Hickey, and he was compelled to sell his printing press. I cannot think of a post-independence publisher who has had that price to pay in India. I hope no one ever will have to, the best efforts of the governments notwithstanding. Yet, we know the East India Company fell, other newspapers flourished, and eventually blossomed into the press, which helped in small ways, I know, to defeat an empire, and later the emergency. I wish I had a more resounding call to action other than to urge you and your friends, fellow travelers, and sworn blood enemies to purchase subscriptions to digital media in India. And I wish I had something more stirring to say other than the choices of who you subscribe to should be guided not by ideology or voting choices, but by calm appraisal of which platforms bring you the most granular information, the most authoritative analysis, and the widest plurality of opinion. This is old-fashioned, boring, old-fashioned journalism. I know, and this competes poorly with the siren song of the troll, if I may defy my own newsroom ban on the word. I'm sure some of you think I'm just whistling in the dark. Perhaps you're right. I think of it as singing a song in the darkness, about the darkness, in the conviction it will see us through until the dawn.
Thank you, Shekhar. If you compare what Shekhar has said today to what Siddharth Varadarajan said in April, two points clearly emerge. One, Shekhar's view that regime change or political activism is not the job of journalists. It's simply truthful reporting. That's what the job is. and representing the widest spectrum of views. There's a clear difference between our two Jindal speakers on this question. And second, this idea that the social contract between the people and journalists is broken now. Whereas the journalist was a hero in 1950s and 60s, not that even after the emergency. But journalist has become an object of ridicule, is seen as a clown or a persistent seeker of government's mercies. Perhaps our three commentators would reflect on this, and they have other things, of course, they might have noted in the lecture that was circulated to them. We'll start with Sadanand Dhume, then we'll go to Ellen Barry, and finally to Salil. Sadanand Dhume is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also the South Asia columnist for the Wall Street Journal. In his earlier incarnations, he served as India Bureau Chief of the Far Eastern Economic Review. I don't think that exists anymore.
No, it doesn't.
Fear doesn't.
Both work there.
Both of you work there, right? And I used to read it quite regularly, especially in Indonesia and Singapore. And
That's where I was based, and so was he. Sadanand was in.
right. And Indonesia correspondent of FAIR, Far Eastern Economic Review, and the Wall Street Journal Asia. And I used to meet Sadanand in Jakarta quite a bit when I was working there. His articles and op-eds have appeared in Foreign Policy, Forbes, Commentary, EL Global, The Washington Post. Television appearances are many, and his political travelogue, which I read with great interest when I was working in Indonesia myself, about the rise of radical Islam in Indonesia. My Friend the Fanatic Travels with the Radical Islamist has been published in 4 countries, and the upcoming book that Sadanand is writing discusses the rise of the new right in India and its impact on Indian democracy. Next 10 minutes are yours, Sadanand. I'll sit here.
Thank you very much, Ashu, for the kind introduction. It's a real honor to be here. During Shekhar's comments, he made the joke about how the commentariat in India is filled with too many people who claim expertise on too many things. But I will start out by politely disagreeing with him, because I myself have learned a lot from Shekhar, who genuinely is, I would say, has a kind of in-depth expertise on a range of subjects which I cannot think of any other person practicing journalism in India comparing with. So among the things that I've learned from not only cricket and not only the Indian national security and the Air Force, but Sri Lankan politics, Assamese student movement, a range of issues where I think that Shekhar is really sort of sets an example in terms of understanding a subject, going really in depth, reporting from the scene when possible, but really sort of capturing it in a level of depth and detail, which I think that is something that journalists, particularly younger journalists and people who are interested in it, should aspire to.
Also Pakistan.
Also Pakistan. Yeah, the list is too long. I'm going to sort of speak a little bit, and first what I'm going to do this, I'll divide this into a few parts, is that first I want a little definitional clarity of what I mean and what many scholars and people over here mean when we talk about the decline of Indian democracy. Because I think it's sort of clear to us when we have a conversation among ourselves, but it's not necessarily clear to a general audience, including people who are watching online. Then I'm going to engage with the meat of Shekhar's lecture. And then finally, I'm going to end with a few very brief thoughts on why my concerns about the state of media freedom, or the challenge that media freedom faces in India, may in fact be somewhat greater than I think came through in Shekhar's lecture. Now, the decline really became, I think, most evident in 2021 when a couple of reports came out in quick succession. The first was that where Freedom House in 2021 decided that India was now no longer free, but now classified as partly free. And this was in the first time since 1997 that this has happened. By classifying India as partly free, it put India in the company of such countries as Ecuador, Albania, and Malawi. Separately, Freedom House classified the Indian-ruled part of Kashmir as unfree, and that was in the same category as Zimbabwe and Afghanistan. Around the same time, VDEM, which is a Swedish institute, announced that, in fact, as of 2019, India had ceased to be a democracy, and in fact, they characterized it instead as an electoral autocracy, which in VDEM's analysis, put India roughly in the same basket as Mali, Kenya, and Hungary, among other countries. Now, why does any of this matter? And I would say that it matters to the world, it matters in a very profound way, because whether or not India is a democracy really determines in large measure whether democracy itself is a mass good or a luxury good. If you look at VDEM's analysis, they say that currently only about 14% of the world's population lives in liberal democracies. These are countries that safeguard freedom of expression and minority rights. And that 14% is almost all concentrated in North America and Western Europe. And there are a few sort of spots in East Asia, Japan, and there are tiny places in Latin America like Uruguay that qualify. But it's essentially the rich world, If India succeeds as a liberal democracy, then democracy is like a cup of coffee. You can have it anywhere. If India fails as a liberal democracy, then democracy, it appears, is more like a Louis Vuitton bag, not necessarily available to people in all countries. So it's profoundly important for the world. It matters to the US. I work at a US think tank, the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, because for many years, at least dating back to the Cold War, the US has believed that the liberal international order is best maintained by powerful liberal democracies, and that in general we are safer in the United States if the world is more democratic. So it's no coincidence that after the end of the Cold War, that the US invested a lot of effort in ensuring that not only was the former East Germany was integrated into the democratic West Germany, but also that countries like Poland and most of the former Warsaw Pact countries turn towards democracy. But I'd say most of all, it's important to India itself. And here I want to reference Ashu's work, Professor Ashu's work, where he has talked about the three foundational projects of independent India: national integration, social justice, and poverty elimination, and that all of these three have been pursued under a framework of democracy. And the question that raises for me is, will that framework of democracy continue to exist over time? Obviously, it's not a question we can answer over here. Or will it become unrecognizable? And what will be the consequences for those three goals, for national integration, for social justice, and for poverty elimination, should India's democracy cease to be recognizable? What exactly do we mean, though, when we say that Indian democracy has declined? And this is something I get a lot of pushback on social media. So every time I write a column about it or mention it in an article or share a piece of scholarship, I get a sort of response from people who are, I think many of whom are genuinely bewildered by this question. And the reason they're bewildered is that as Professor Varshney pointed out, turnout in India and elections in India are very robust. Turnout in the last election was 67%. More than 610 million Indians voted. 229 million people voted for the BJP. So if you tell a person, an average Indian, that, look, Indian democracy is in danger, they'll say, what are you smoking? We had more than 610 million voters. People accept the elections. People accept the results. Power changes hands by the ballot. These are all signs of a healthy democracy, and they have a point. But what we mean is something slightly more subtle, and something that Professor Varshney spoke about in his opening remarks as well, which is that the liberal institutions that are designed to check the abuse of power by government are fraying. You have that's true in the case of the courts. It's true in the case of the professional civil service, which is supposed to be neutral. It's true in the case of civil society groups, human rights groups, and other groups that are under siege, under attack from the government. And finally, of course, it's true, I would argue, in the case of the media. So let me sort of simplify, in the interest of time, Shekhar's argument as I understood it, and then after that add on what I think are sort of additional worries. And I would sort of, if I had to sort of really oversimplify this in the era of Twitter, I could divide his talk almost into half, which is sort of talking about let's not exaggerate the problem, and half which is talking about, well, here are the problems that we face. And then the part where he's talking about let's not exaggerate how bad it is, he points out, rightly of course, that police action and harsh laws are not new. They go back to the East India Company, Nehru's First Amendment, Indira Gandhi's emergency, Rajiv Gandhi's battle with the media, and so on. There was no pre-lapsarian time before 2014, because for much of modern Indian political history, the ruling party has had an unhealthy influence on the editorial leadership of major news organizations and on coverage. And I think anyone who has been writing about India would say that this is self-evidently true. I remember in 2000 and maybe 2010 or 2011, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about where I talked about how people tiptoed around the Gandhi family, and it was titled India's Gandhi God Kings. And that was not a piece that, when I wrote it back then, would, I think, have been run by most major Indian newspapers, because it would have been seen as, you know, as going too far. I could publish it because I was publishing in the Wall Street Journal. So I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I 100% agree that with Shekhar here, where I quote, where he says that India is not a dictatorial dystopia in which journalism has become impossible. Then he sort of, let's turn to his four places where he thinks that the four big new challenges, and in fact he mentions five, though he mentions four in the list, but he talks about the misuse of laws to clamp down on free speech, the opposition being illiberal too. I think that's true. Most of these sort of Indian chief ministers are basically petty despots. And I would argue that if you were living in Calcutta, it's probably easier to write op-eds criticizing Modi than it is to criticize than it is to criticize Mamata Banerjee. And you can make that similar parallel in many of the states. Corporate ownership of the media. It's no coincidence, as he points out, that the most robust newspapers are the ones that are not owned by people who have other business interests. And what he calls the establishment's IT warriors. I use a less delicate term. I call them the Hindutva Troll Army, HTA. And then he talks about a fifth challenge, which is about the revenues and conclave summits and so on, and how digital revenues are not commensurate with digital audiences. I agree with all of this, and I think it's sort of, all of it is something that, if you take it together, it sort of adds up to a troubling picture. But in many ways, I think the problem is, in fact, in deeper. And I would argue that there are three problems that, the way I see it, are sort of create greater cause for concern. The first is that there is virtually no defense of liberal principles on the Hindu right. Where, for example, is the debate among the Hindu right on something like electoral bonds? It's an open and shut case. It is pretty obvious that to anyone who has even spent 5 minutes looking at it, that the way the electoral bonds were designed, and Siddharth Varadarajan, who gave the last lecture, spoke about this also, where the way the electoral bonds are designed, they're completely opaque for the public, but the political parties, particularly the government, would know who's giving money to whom, and that actually makes even elections, which is the strongest part of Indian democracy, somewhat lopsided. I see no defense of any of these principles. So when someone gets picked up, or a comedian is thrown in jail, or a journalist is thrown in jail under terrorism laws, I see a lot of the usual suspects who are the sort of liberals speaking about this, but where is a defense of liberal principles from the people who are ideologically dominant today? What you see is silence, and what you say instead from them is, why did Barkha tweet this and why did Rajdeep tweet that? And after 8 years of the BJP being in power, the inability to create an alternative intellectual ecosystem on the right that in fact stands up for liberal principles while contesting the hegemony of what was the liberal left, that is a serious problem. The second is retreat from the public square. So we could have this profound discussion over here with all sort of well-read people who spent a lot of time in the trenches, and somebody could tomorrow tweet an article saying that all of this was put together by Hillary Clinton and an imaginary Swedish NGO, and then it could be shared by some fake news website that's part of the larger RSS ecosystem. And believe me, there would be many, many more people retweeting and engaging that piece. And George Soros, we can throw him into, through sort of retweeting and sharing that conspiracy theory. And then I can be almost certain that it'll show up in my family WhatsApp group. It'll show up in an alumni WhatsApp group. And that will be what is engaged with and what is believed. So that is a retreat of regions. So it's not just those people on TV with, saying that you need to give money and mustard oil for Shani. But there's a deeper retreat from reason. And finally, I would say that the liberal project in India, and Professor Vashni among others has also spoken about this, was an elite project. The people who wrote the Constitution represented elites in every possible way, including educationally. The liberal project was an elite project. It was a flawed project, as these projects always are. But as the old elite has retreated, it has not been replaced by a new elite that has any kind of commitment to underlying liberal values or principles. It may have some kind of instrumental commitment to elections, but not much beyond that. And even with elections, I think if they get a chance, they're more than willing to tilt the playing field. And I think what this means is that because this creates stresses for Indian democracy or liberalism in India, this also creates very deep stresses for the media, which is ultimately embedded within that framework of liberalism and the legitimacy of the media, I would say sort of beyond some of the issues that Shekhar mentioned in his excellent talk. So why don't I leave it at that? Thank you.
Our next commentator is Ellen Barry, currently reporting for the New York Times, has been reporting for the New York Times for a long time. And before she moved to Boston, she was the London-based chief international correspondent for the Times. Before that, the South Asia bureau chief, where most of us met her, in Delhi, 2013 to 2017. And in 2020, she was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in the feature writing that all of us admired, The Jungle Prince of Delhi. We did want her to win that prize, but we don't decide. Before India, Ellen was a correspondent and then bureau chief for the New York Times in Moscow. And while in Russia, she was part of a team which won the 2011 Pulitzer for international reporting for a series on impunity in the country's justice system. She's been a finalist for feature writing, Pulitzer finalist for feature writing in 2001, beat reporting 2004, and breaking news as part of a team in 2007. This is the first time, I think, Ellen is visiting us at Brown. Welcome. Next 10 minutes are yours.
Well, I couldn't say no to this invitation because anyone who, if you know any foreign correspondents or if you've ever worked as a foreign correspondent, you know that there are always a handful of people who you call 6 times a week. And you ask them every stupid question that comes into your mind. And Ashu is one of them. Shekar and Sadanand are others, and Salil is just my friend. But people who do this kind of reporting, they depend very heavily on patient guides, and you've all been my guides, so thank you. So in 2013, I arrived in India for the first time after 5 years in Russia. And it was during a period of quite active consolidation of power. Putin had just returned to the presidency, and conditions were changing. They were changing for me, as well as for all of the Russian press. And the way this would look when you're on the ground as a foreign correspondent is, you would call to sit down with someone who has talked to you regularly over the course of years, and they would no longer be available. Or you would make a plan to go to a provincial city, and you would set up a series of interviews, and you would get there, and the interviews would be canceled. At that time, you could almost watch new lines of propaganda coming out through state television and rippling through the population, and really transforming public opinion almost as you watched it. It was extraordinary. And then on top of that, every now and then, there would be news of an arrest of someone who has been out there protesting the government for the last 35 years, a 70-year-old opposition activist or, a 25-year-old blogger. And I used to go to someone who was sort of had been a Kremlin spin doctor, to try and interpret this for me and say, what's going on? I asked that question many times. And I remember he used to say, the system is telling us that the rules have changed. The system is telling us that the rules have changed. So India obviously was a huge culture shock on many different levels. On the night that we arrived, I had 2 small children, and we stayed in a guest house. We lined all our shoes up outside the door of the guest house, and it rained so much that night that our shoes floated away, and we couldn't find them. But the biggest thing was simply that the information space was almost unrecognizably different. The kind of urge to communicate is something that as an outsider, I had never really encountered a society with as much energy around communication. I don't know how else to put it. One of the first stories I covered was the sentencing of the suspects in the Delhi gang rape, and I remember almost getting trampled by the journalists who were running from one side of the courtroom to the other and thinking, this is really different. And that was really true the whole time I was in India. People really cared what you wrote, and that was new. At one point, I wrote quite a critical piece about, it was a profile of Yogi Adityanath that caused such a groundswell of vitriol and online threats that for a while I decided that maybe it would be better if I didn't go into the Delhi bureau. And so I thought, where can I go to just wait out the storm? And I planned a reporting trip to a very small town outside Meerut in UP. It was a place that I had gone quite often for reporting trips, so I knew everyone there. And I thought, this is a perfect place to hide out because no one can read. And it was a cast of, I think, wedding band musicians. Anyway, so I got to this very out-of-the-way place and sort of exhaled and sat down on some lady's charpoy. And I was listening to 2 guys sitting under a tree, and one of them said, "Did you hear a journalist called Yogi a terrorist?" So information simply moves faster and at a higher volume than any other place I had reported. And And this seemed to be an innate demand of the public and a characteristic of the society. That said, I was very uneasy to see many things happen during the 4 years I was in India that felt uncomfortably like deja vu. Because when the state consolidates control over information, you learn to recognize the stops along the way because you can see them pass. And in this very eloquent and insightful lecture, Shekar, I think you're skimming past a little bit of this process. You know, it's like a train moving along a track. If it is moving in one direction, it would be foolish to think that it may stop or turn around and go the other way. Modi came into power, and it was clear that he no longer needed the mediation of the press, and he did not want it. He didn't answer questions from journalists, and that was no longer necessary to his system. The way he used social media, which was very forward-thinking, was almost like his voice was in your ear all the time. He didn't need anyone to carry it to you. And that was clear immediately, that the press was no longer necessary to the system. You know, one of the deja vu moments was the raid on NDTV, which happened shortly before I left. But again, it was uncomfortable because it was so familiar. And that was a story that ran on page A9 in the armpit of the paper. But it was a message. It was the system telling us that the rules had changed. A few months later, all the foreign correspondents got an email saying that foreigners were banned from traveling from 10 different places, including the places where the government was under most scrutiny for its actions. So the Andaman Islands and Kashmir and Assam, we foreign correspondents needed, for the first time, explicit approval from the foreign ministry. Again, this is the system telling us that the rules were changing. These are the precise places where the authorities have most interest to lie and obfuscate about what they are doing, and it is sort of a blatant obstruction of freedom of the press, but it was no longer a concern to the Indian government, which no longer seemed to depend on the sort of good opinion of foreign interlocutors on that score. But then I think probably my biggest concern is something that Shekhar describes as a sort of archipelago of excellence. And it is excellent, and I admire so the people who work on that archipelago. But the notion of an archipelago is in and of itself a problem, because I saw it before in Russia. So for 15 years, there were spaces for those who questioned the government, who scrutinized the government, and they were brilliant spaces with great journalists like Echo Moskvy and Novaya Gazeta and TV Dozhd. And I remember once asking someone who is quite close to the Russian system, why do you let these places exist? And I was told that it was such an interesting answer, that limited zones of freedom are essential to the state that we want to build. And this gentleman said to me, he was talking about some of the overseers of this sort of the information space, and they say, we protect the borders. He said, within the borders, let there be chaos and plasma. We are the protectors of the borders of the system, but do not cross the borders. And people were satisfied living that way. Those who were not supportive of government policy knew that they were in the minority, but they wanted this information, even if it was on an archipelago. it was still available, and it was in its own way a kind of thriving subculture. But what happened early this year is that that archipelago simply ceased to exist. Those zones of freedom disappeared, and they disappeared, and it was shocking to me, almost overnight. The archipelago sort of slipped under the water, and the waters closed over it as if it hadn't been there. And because it had been confined to such an enclosed space, it really didn't make an impression on the mass of the population. It was no longer connected to the mass of the population. So it worries me to think that only a small handful of publications are able to report and print honest, accurate journalism, because an archipelago is just never a safe place to rest, especially when the waters are rising.
Limited zones of freedom can disappear overnight, is the message from Ellen. They can't be imagined as, or one can't be sure about that they would be stable. Our last commentator is Salil Tripathi. He has the advantage of having been here in April as well, and comment on Siddharth. So Salil was born in Bombay, lives in New York, chaired PEN International's Writer in Prison Committee, very important committee from 2015 to 2021. His honors include the Red Ink Award from the Mumbai Press Club for Human Rights Journalism, and several other awards. His books include Offense, The Hindu Case, The Bangladesh War and Its Unquiet Legacy, published by Yale, also University Press in 2016, Detours, Songs of the Open Road, and is currently writing a book that all of us are waiting for, The Gujaratis. The Gujaratis, I'm waiting for it, yeah. He's a Gujarati himself, though from Bombay. Salil studied in Bombay until he got to Dartmouth, where he got an MBA degree from the Tuck School. So Salil, welcome again.
The advantage of being the last is that a lot of what you want to say has been said by other people before you. So I won't repeat what they've said. The disadvantage is that I'm standing between you and a nice glass of wine or tea or coffee. So I'll try to be brief at the same time. I'll do my best. But I do want to, like everybody else, and this is not a roast for you, Shekhar, but I do want to start by thanking Shekhar for being an exemplary colleague of mine, and senior, slightly senior to me, a few months here or there. But at India Today, there were many outrageous and ridiculous story ideas I would come up with, and he was one of the few senior correspondents and principal correspondents or editors later who saw the value in the story and backed me. And India Today was like India, right? In the sense that Delhi controlled everything, and I was in the boondocks. And boondocks was Bombay, but still, for them it was boondocks. And he still backed me up. So thank you for all that you did. I have some great stories which I can...
Among the many errors I might have made.
and he has given me some great sound bites, which I will say after 3 or 4 glasses of wine, but I'll wait for that, yeah. You know, Shekar walks the talk. I mean, he makes others walk the talk. But journalists in India, sadly, were once asked by L.K. Advani, for those of us old enough to remember that, L.K. Advani used to be at one time the Information and Broadcasting Minister of India, soon after the emergency. And he told the Indian journalists soon after that you were asked to bend and you crawled, right? And I recently wrote a piece for the Roundtable, which is an academic journal, about Indian media at 75, because everyone writes about India at 75 these days. And one of the things I said was that these days, if the Prime Minister or anyone from his office, like Uday Mahurkar, our former colleague, who's now one of the spokespeople in the government hierarchy, if he were to say, jump, a lot of the TV network reporters, with a few notable exceptions like Ravish and a few others, will say, "How high, sir?" That's where we have come. And in such a context, Shekhar walks. He doesn't jump when someone asks him, and he doesn't crawl. So thank you for being who you are. The most embarrassing thing I've seen about Indian media is this image, which was I think 2014 or 15. I mean, I've not been in Delhi for a long time, where there were the 20 or 30 journalists stood with Mr. Modi to take a selfie and literally craning to be in the photo as though they were being next to, I don't even know the Bollywood actresses, so I'll go with Madhuri Dixit. But I'm sure there are, more important actors today going on. And it was embarrassing. I mean, it was genuinely embarrassing, but that's what Indian media has come to, of being close to power, of, Shekhar spoke about the need for media organizations to have a public event, like a conference, and the conference only succeeds if Mr. Modi or Piyush Goyal, one of the top ministers, comes, and if they don't, that's the death knell, and it's also the termination notice for the editor, because that's the subterranean message in that. We need to know that. But I don't want to talk too much about democracy. We're here to talk about media, so I don't want to go into the democracy part. But I do want to, because everyone's talked about the VDEM and the Freedom House and The Economist and all of the surveys that have come out about India. When I went back from Dartmouth back to Bombay, I remember there was a US diplomat who lived at Altamont Road. I lived at Kemp's Corner, close enough to me. I went up to meet him one evening, and he said, your party is over. And by your, he meant India's party is over. I said, what do you mean by that? He said, this was 1988. The Berlin Wall was still there. Václav Havel was still in jail. Lech Walesa was still trying to be in power and all the rest. And we all liked Viktor Orban because he was supposed to be a nice liberal Democrat. Little did we know. But that's the situation that's the time I'm talking about. I said, why? What party is over? He said, the party that is over is India being the only major democracy out of the Western world. In 2 or 3 years, you're going to have all these East European countries becoming free. South Africa will change, and you'll have 50 or 60 countries which regularly hold elections, and you will be known as a country that holds elections, and not one that's a democracy. It was a salient lesson. I didn't like it. I was fresh from, I was 23, 24, 25, something like that. I was really angry about it, but I think he's right in the end. That, increasingly, recently, Karan is here in the room, a wonderful writer, by the way. Please read his fiction and non-fiction, of course. But he recently participated in this project we put together on India at 75 for PEN America, where writers like him and Salman Rushdie and Jhumpa Lahiri and Romila Thapar and Perumal Murugan, you name everyone, they were all there basically lamenting what has become of India. And it was, again, I want to touch that because I know that we've all talked about that this is not a Modi problem. It is probably an Indian problem. And yes, but the intensity is different. As Ellen was saying, the rules are changing. And I think the system wants a different set of ways in which we look at these things. And that's exactly the point here, that we want to get out of this so-called whataboutery problem. Shekhar is absolutely right when he talks about the fact that nuance is not possible on social media. And it's true. There is no nuance on social media, and therefore the immediate response to anything you say is, what about? So when some minor BJP politician says something really nasty about Muhammad, who many Muslims revere as a prophet, at that time, and half of the Middle East want to shut off India, they say, but what about Salman Rushdie? You defended him. Why can't you defend her? But there's chalk and there is cheese, right? And I think we do need to bear that in mind, that all expression is not art, but all art is expression. And I think that nuance is getting lost right now, and we are reaching a period. Of course, Congress had a terrible record. You're absolutely right that the laws by which journalists are being persecuted today in India were probably set in 1924 with the Sedition Act. The laws by which people are being threatened in India came a long time ago. And yes, and Chidambaram, who is a victim of these laws, is an architect and a perpetrator of some of these laws. So, I have no sympathy for those who went ahead. But that's no comfort to Siddiq Kapan. That's no comfort to Gauri Lankesh. And that's no comfort to any other journalist or writer today in India who faces threat to be told, oh, it used to be much worse. So what? That's not the point. The point is there is a battle today that needs to be fought aggressively, and again, fought on facts. I think the crucial thing is to remember where the facts are and where the truth is. So I'm no fan of the regimes that went by. I mean, Shekhar will remember when we were at India Today together. India Today, by the way, was the first magazine to mention satanic verses, the first magazine to actually run excerpts from it, and the first to write an editorial criticizing the ban. And again, I have to thank Shekhar and T.N. Nainan, who were bold enough to let me, a mere rookie reporter, to write that editorial. Because editorials were written by Nainan, Dilip Bob, Prabhu Chawla, and Indrajit Badwar. Us reporters never had the unwashed masses. We were the unwashed masses. We never had the chance to do that. But I did want to write it. I asked Shekhar, can I do it? He said, see what you can write, let me see. And he helped me there. So, I mean, so this is not, but I thought I should bring that in. And he's absolutely right that Modi did not create Nellie or Delhi. But what I did not see in his talk, and I hope it was only out of not a design. It was a matter. Was any mention of Gujarat of 2002? Modi was in Gujarat. Either he was incompetent or he perpetrated it. Either he was incompetent in not handling it right, and lots of people have written about that, or he was actually a perpetrator, which lots of people have been alleging, and not winning the cases in the Indian court system. So I think we do have to remember that he doesn't come with a very clean record, untouched by the past. He has a huge record that he needs to be answerable to. Again, Shekhar mentioned Hashimpura. I'm so glad he brought it up. But who was the judge who gave the judgment about it? Justice Muralidhar. And what's happening to him today? He gives one judgment against Anurag Thakur, I think his name is, one of the BJP politicians. He was shunted immediately to Punjab. Within 2 weeks, before things get worse in Punjab, he was shunted to Orissa. And now he was about to be named in the Presidium to be a judge, a High Court Chief Justice, which is the acme of his career, as it would be, because he can't anymore go to the Supreme Court. His is the only name not accepted by the government. Now, these are the questions that are coming to the fore precisely by the people like Gautam Bhatia, who writes this wonderful blog on law, which I would strongly recommend to anyone interested in Indian law. But none of the mainstream media really picks it up. Scroll does, Wire does, and so on, and so would Print, but not the others. So, yes, and I agree with you. So I'm told I've got 2 minutes. I know we have questions, so I'll be very quick. The misuse of penal code, terror, and tax laws is true. I agree with you completely. The noise of the lynch mob is very, very nasty. And the Indian media crisis goes beyond Mr. Modi. Mr. Modi is the personification of what could go wrong. It's as if Indira Gandhi was really efficient, in a way. That's what Narendra Modi is all about. I've always said that if Sanjay Gandhi were Prime Minister, he would have been Narendra Modi today. And that's where we are. And I think we do need to bear in mind. One minor point, yes, you were absolutely right, Shekhar, in praising Indian Express in the 70s. But I would also want to praise the statesmen, not just during the emergency, but even before that, in challenging things like the bank nationalization and so on, because of its Tata connection. Let's be honest about it. The big challenges are fake news and so on. You mentioned Hickey. I would also want to mention Horniman. Without him, we would not have known Jallianwala happened. And there's a circle named after him in Bombay. Last few points, and this goes back to Sadanand's point. The right wing does not talk about liberal principles because they don't find them desirable. They don't like them. They claim to be classic liberals, and they claim to take on the persona of economic right wing and so on, but they're not really like that because Modi government is extremely statist. It bans currencies when it wants to. It has crony capitalists to whom it gives assets, and there's not a word. So they're not really liberal in the classic sense. That's all I would say. And finally, I do want to shout out Scroll, Print, Article 14, Wire, the Pari Network, and Khabar Lahariya for doing excellent work. And the fact that they are all online and not in print is a very important question. And finally, my very final point that, you talked about the darkness and dawn. All I can do is that, is this the darkness before the dawn? I'll quote Brecht, who said that, it is dark times. Will there be singing in the dark times? Yes, there will be singing, but about the darkness. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
one sign of how interesting this panel and inspired by Shekhar's terrific lecture is that I'm going to announce right now that we extend our meeting by 15 minutes. So we are saying, because we need the audience involved now, right? So let's do the Q&A, and we'll go on till 4:10, 4:15, and then we'll break for our reception. Okay, is that okay, Stephanie? Well, I know she will. So, who will start? Introduce yourself, please, and tell us who the question is addressed to.
Yeah, so I'm Shreyas. I'm an undergraduate studying computer science. I'm a junior here, and my question is addressed to Shekhar, Mr. Shekhar. So when you talk about digital media, especially platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and all that, the algorithms there, like that recommend me the content I want to watch, rewards polarization, and you clearly mentioned it when you were speaking, right? And I feel that I have significantly less agency over what I'm consuming these days, especially on when I'm consuming news, specifically information. So it's more about who has the best social media optimization than the content itself, which was apparent from the examples you had given. So how do you tackle that as a digital media agency?
And we collect 3 questions.
Okay.
Then, who will go next? Tehara, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tehara. I am a master's student in the public affairs program here at Brown. My question is also to Mr. Shekhar. With the rise of India's anti-Muslim rhetoric, which is fueled further by Modi's Hindu nationalistic agenda, what does, in your opinion, the future of media look like for Muslim journalists on the ground like Rana Ayub and other Muslim journalists?
Okay. Somebody else would like to? Okay, let's. So Shekhar, we can start with you. Let's follow the following rule. Let's have you speak either to these questions first or to the 3 commentators. Whatever comes to your mind as more pressing intellectual.
Okay, so let me answer these questions first. See, the SEO question that confronts everybody now. Even the legacy newspapers, which are increasingly shifting to revenues from subscribers and from internet advertising and sponsorships. So you can't wish it away. So we are now 5 years old. Until 5 years, until now, we don't have an SEO team, which is not something that's sustainable. So before coming in, I might have okayed the hiring of our first SEO person, so 1 person. But SEO people don't just make sure that every article should have or every headline should have bikini or sex in it. I think the three most popular words for SEO walas are bikini, sex, and housewife for some reason. In India, it's also IAS. I think one, because everybody wants to be an IAS, or they know that they are ruled by IAS, or because IAS people themselves have such strong WhatsApp groups and they share the article on their WhatsApp group. So sometimes you laugh, sometimes you let it be, but we are all learning. So my own column, for example, National Interest, it publishes in a newspaper as well. Simultaneously, it publishes in Business Standard, for which we write a 3-word headline, because they only have 3 words or 4 words in a headline. And we write 105-character headline for our web version that we publish. It's an exchange with Business Standard. They publish my article, we publish Tiananmen's article. So you learn these things without, so people like us who've never done it. I became a journalist, full-time wage-paid journalist at 19. I'm now 65, so I've been a journalist for 46 years. Right? So you learn new things. So this is a new thing that we are learning now. You have to learn it, you don't have to misuse it, and you don't have to become prisoners to it. But what an SEO person also does is they're professionals that need to be respected. They will check out their own software and see what is trending, what is it that people are reading. Mulayam Singh Yadav dies. Mulayam Singh Yadav dies, immediately everybody will do stories, obituaries, etc. on Mulayam Singh Yadav. So those who might not know, he was one of the eminent leaders of the Hindi heartland who took away the Muslim vote from the Congress party. But a good SEO person will tell you that there is a lot of curiosity suddenly about somebody called Ram Manohar Lohia. Now, who knows Lohia? If I walked around in my newsroom, nobody would know who Lohia is, barring those who are 45 plus. That is editors. So suddenly curiosity about Ram Manohar Lohia, who founded this unique ideology in India, Lohiaism, which I call repeatedly the worst kind of socialism. Because if you make an amalgam of socialism, nativism, and nationalism, you can't get worse than that, right? So Mulayam Singh was a follower of Lohia. He was the last Lohiaite, right? Lohia is the founder of Sinophobia in India. In 1945, he said India must not let China take over Tibet. So suddenly, the publications where SEO people were smart, those publications immediately put out stories saying who was Ram Manohar Lohia. And I will not name that publication again, but publication that was the smartest at it got the traffic. So I say in my newsroom that you have to be quick with stories. You have to spot trends. What is it that people are interested in? Because early bird catches the worm. Ones who get left behind eat bird shit, right? So newsroom language can be a little bit harsh. So SEO is a fact of life. It's like the readership survey. Readership survey happened later. SEO happens in real time. So that's one. Second is Muslim journalists who work for institutions. They'll be okay. They are okay. In fact, some of them are the best journalists in India. We had one. We have several, but particularly one who we lost to another organization. I really miss her. Not because she's gone to another organization and she's Muslim, but because she was among our brightest young people. And I thought she could have done a lot more with her journalistic skills than just doing advocacy. So that is fine. The problem arises, challenge arises for those who are in the campaigning, advocacy, journalism. And there the system will go after you. And when the system goes after you, you have to count on the institutions to stand for you. Institutions have been far from perfect. People do get justice by and large in Supreme Court, but by the time you come to Supreme Court, you've already spent several months, if not a couple of years, definitely several weeks in jail. And I can tell you that having to spend even one day in jail is not pleasant. To be denied your liberty, even for 8 hours, is a crime unfairly. And those threats persist. Fortunately, so far, it hasn't gone to that level, but it might at some point of time. As we speak, government has filed fairly serious charge sheets against Rana Ayub. And this is under PMLA, an act where bail is very difficult, and where you are guilty as charged. The default principle is that you are guilty as charged, right? So, and this will target not only Muslim journalists. This will target especially all of those who are activists in the activist/journalistic space, and who are not embedded in institutions, because institutions, if nothing else, pay your legal bills. They pay your legal bills, they defend you, so on and so forth. So those are the two questions.
Can I just say here that you seem to be once again drawing a distinction between journalism as advocacy versus journalism as reporting, right?
Well, I will
and
tell
you're
you
saying you're saying Muslim journalists who are reporting within institutions, they're doing fine, but Muslim journalists who become advocates or are in political activism are in danger. Is that what you're saying?
not just Muslim journalists, but I think anybody, Muslim journalists get targeted even more and more viciously, particularly if they are women. They are targeted. Women journalists anywhere get targeted much more viciously on social media. Muslim women journalists, even more so. There is a Muslim woman journalist in Pakistan, a young journalist who wrote an article for us just last week, Yusra Askari. So I replied to, I shared that article with a little compliment saying, brilliant Yusra Askari. I've known her since she was maybe 2 months old. Right? She is the daughter of niece of Hamid Haroon, the owner of the Dawn Group of newspapers in Pakistan. Hamid's been my friend forever. So she replied to me, thank you, uncle. That was enough to let loose so much attack on her. Why did you take your uncle to your country and keep him there? Hey, Shekhar Gupta, Pakistani women journalists are calling you uncle, huh? Etc., etc. So women get much more of this attention anyway. But this is a complex thing, Ashu. I am very old-fashioned. I just told you my age, so I have the right to be old-fashioned. I am very old-fashioned in terms of who is described as a journalist. I completely detest the idea as an abomination of something called citizen journalism. I mean, when you start getting treated by citizen doctors and take citizen lawyers to defend you in a court, I will start reading and hearing stuff from citizen journalists. So an activist also has as much right to their ideas and to be free and to campaign as a journalist. But every activist is not a journalist. So, because journalism is very boring, right? Journalism is not as exciting or as heady as activism. If you want to be an activist, there is space for activism. But punishment levels from the state for activists will be tougher, higher than there are for journalists, unfortunately. You might say that journalists are cowardly, right? That journalists work in newsroom discipline, or that journalists have protection of their editors, owners, journalistic bodies, but that is the reality.
Salil wants to say something. He raised his hand.
To boost your point, actually, because I've worked with, as you know, and as everyone in this room probably knows, I used to work with Amnesty International as a researcher on business and human rights. And I remember when we were told, and I worked not on India, we had a rule that we couldn't work on, quote unquote, your own country. So I was working on around the world. And I remember we were told that 43 people had been killed outside an oil installation that Chevron or Shell owned in the Niger Delta. And immediately all of the Amnesty movement wanted to run a campaign against them. And I said, but first we have to ascertain the facts. And we raised the money, I went to Nigeria, and I found that 1 person had died and 19 were injured. And I came back with that report. And this is not to put anyone at Amnesty on the back pedal or back foot, as it were, to use a cricketing phrase. But they were very disappointed. A lot of my colleagues were disappointed. They said, we thought the 43 were dead. What was the point of spending so much money and going there for one? And I think that's the difference between the activist and the journalist. The activists are after a moral truth. And the journalists are supposed to be after facts. And confusing the two roles is a big problem. And it's a problem that even UN special rapporteurs have about whether to call journalists human rights defenders. And journalists will take a human rights story seriously, but they will also talk to the other side. A good journalist would talk to the other side and point out exactly this kind of a situation, that it's not as simple as that. And therefore, journalists who want to be activists should beware, because then they should re-describe themselves. And I find it hard daily because I still work with an advocacy organization and where I'm very clear about what I say. Pen, everything I do, I'm very clear. But when I write pure reporting, I go back to the kind of lessons people like Nihal Singh and Mulgaonkar and Frank Moraes taught us, and Shekhar and all of us learned when we were starting out. Yeah, thanks.
Sadanand wants to comment.
Very briefly. I just want to say it's even more complicated than that, because we have to sort of, as part of this question of our compact with readers, we have to acknowledge two competing facts. One is that it is certainly true that the government misuses laws and abuses its power. But that does not necessarily mean that we as journalists suspend all skepticism and always assume that the government is wrong and the accusations are false. I'm not talking about any particular case, but I'm just saying it tends to be quite more complicated.
Last few minutes, Shekhar, would you like to comment on what you heard from the commentators?
Yes, I think, first of all, thank you for all the nice things you said and the nasty things you didn't say. I'm interested particularly, two or 3 points. Ellen, you said that defense of liberal principles through an archipelago is dangerous because waters are rising. To which my answer would be yes, but you have to try and expand this archipelago, and that's why an organization like ThePrint, it didn't exist 5 years back. Today it gets more than 20 lakh readers every month, and we don't spend a rupee on promotion. And as I just said, we don't have an SEO manager yet, and we are very unhyphenated, very non-polarized, very boring, and very factual. And facts are not exciting. Fiction or opinion or polarized opinion is more exciting. So you have to build new things are coming up. And everything doesn't last forever. Russia's example is there. I hope we don't go that way. God forbid if we go that way. Look, I could have just cut it and be done with it. I had the option, in fact, I examined the option of setting myself up when I left the Express. At a point when I got bored having done the same thing for a long time, I thought rather than become a potted plant here, I'll do something else. I thought I'd set myself up like Farid, write columns, do more TV shows, write books. I would have been fine. But why the itch to set up a new newsroom? It would take a new panga at 60, right?
Did you just call Farid a potted plant?
Pardon me?
Did you just call Farid a potted plant?
No. No. I said the opposite. I said if I had stayed on in the Express in a comfortable, very well-paying job where my job was done. That was a company that was dead in the water and fossilized. It was brought back to life. It was made debt-free. It became profitable on month-on-month basis. There was money in the bank. And now what was there to do? I could have just sat and enjoyed the fruit of that success. So that would have made me a potted plant with a lot of fertilizer and a lot of water and air-conditioned environment. That not Farid. No. Farid, there's a different story which I shall tell you because it's so interesting. So when I was going through this dilemma of whether to set myself up like Farid or do something new. So we have another common friend, Ruchir Sharma, who now writes a column at FT. So I asked Ruchir, what should I do? And Ruchir said, you will do it very well, like Farid. Go ahead and do it. I went and met Farid, and he said, you must write a book every 3 years. So Ruchir said, but you...
Every 3 years.
So Ruchir said, but you will not be happy. So I said, why would I not be happy? So he said, because you are not a tiger. So the moment he said that, my face fell. And of course I'm a tiger. Everybody told me I'm a tiger. How dare this guy say? And he's my friend. He says you're not a tiger. And then he paused and he said, you are not a tiger, you are a lion. And he said, both are magnificent animals. But a tiger is a loner. A lion needs his pride. So you will not be happy being a tiger. You need a pride. So set up a newsroom. So I said, all you're trying to tell me that I'm a lazy old bugger who should set up a newsroom, right? And have people bring me my Shekar and my lunch and dinner, and I enjoy myself. So Siddharth has done something after being the editor of a major newspaper. He set up something new. Other people have done these. Digital technologies have lowered the entry barriers, so we can do these things. That's the reason Modi government is also paying a lot of attention to all of us. And one of the ways in which they pay that attention is by going after your possible sources of revenue. So your sponsorships, you have to start with the presumption that I can't do lavish events. They deny access to your reporters. This is guerrilla warfare. They deny access to your reporters. You send your reporters to the field because there they can't hide what's happening. So this is a warfare that goes on. It's a good warfare, and I think as long as it doesn't get too nasty, you can manage it. That's one. The second is I think two speakers mentioned that India's right wing does not have any defense of classic liberalism. That's because India's right wing intellectuals never came up. And a lot of the blame for that lies not only with Congress governments, which 1969 onwards, as Mrs. Gandhi made her hard left shift, emptied all her campuses of any thinking which was not the establishment hard left thinking, JNU included. So India did not produce a Neil Ferguson. There was no space for any of those. So India's right I'm sorry to say that, India's right does not have intellectual firepower. So India's right asserts itself on Twitter. Twitter was made for India's right, right? Twitter and now WhatsApp. And that's the reason a lot of this WhatsApp propaganda, revisionist history is now working. If India had real scholarship on the right, some of this would be questioned. That is the other one. Third, who said Madhuri Dixit?
I did.
Yeah, Madhuri
My
Dixit.
age, you know.
Your age. So I think if you had mentioned Madhuri Dixit, you would still be right. Because at this moment, she is the most discussed, she's the most watched, she is the most trending actor. Because of her new teleserial, please watch it, OTT Majama, which is where she acts in a lesbian relationship.
All right.
Right? And this is among her best performances.
She's amazing. I wrote the India Today cover on her. Yeah.
So that was a long time back. But if you had stuck with your first love, you would have still been okay.
Okay. Thank you.
It's time to bring this session to a close. And but before we do that, let's thank Shekhar, Ellen, Sadanand, and Salil for providing a wonderful Friday afternoon, a very stimulating Friday afternoon. And second, there is a reception waiting for you outside, and you have another 45 minutes there with our panelists and with Shekhar, the main speaker today. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for those watching online.